Welcome to Snapshots, where we discuss current events and trends in our economy. My name is Ibrahim Adrame, and I'm the Director of Education at the Henry George School of Social Science. My guest today is Dr. Aleksandr Gevorkyan, Associate Professor of Economics and Finance at St. John University, and also a trustee at the Henry George School of Social Science. Welcome to Snapshots, Alek.
Hello, Ibrahim. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by asking you, what are diaspora bonds and what makes them attractive debt instruments for governments compared to traditional finance?
So it's good that we start with a definition. Diaspora bonds are such sovereign debt securities that are issued by governments, specifically targeting what we call diaspora investors. And the benefit is that, or at least the expected benefit is that diaspora bonds can result in lower borrowing costs and attract greater capital than otherwise would be expected for a developing economy or even an emerging market. The big question here is, what is a diaspora? And let me know if you want me to elaborate on this longer. Sure. Okay. One of the difficulties with that definition is that recently, over the past few years, maybe a decade, it has become a very popular term in reference to recent waves of migration from across the world. And it is not necessarily just about developing economies, but countries like New Zealand or Spain or Ireland, Scotland, they are talking about their diaspora and attracting diaspora investors. The challenge here is to actually understand the nature of a diaspora, and maybe we'll talk on this a bit later, a bit more. But I'll just say the first thing to recognize about this is that just because there's some sort of a common ground among people who are living abroad, something common about their connection with that perceived homeland, that is not necessarily sort of sufficient condition for them to engage with the country. But let's maybe talk about this later. Yeah.
Good. So in general, what sort of projects are these bonds targeted at and why?
Right. So historically, the bonds, if they're issued, have been used for two purposes. One is the general revenue, which is essentially sort of a system through which government borrows and sort of allocates the monies in whichever direction they decide is most important and whatever the priorities are. But more specific, second sort of direction is to borrow money for specific and attract funds for specific projects, usually in infrastructure. And that has been the case of the most successful diaspora bonds issuances.
So if I understand you, infrastructures are targeted mainly because traditional finance are sometimes hesitant to do it, and therefore...
Right, because technically we would be dealing with a country that has certain difficulties, whatever those might be, accessing international capital markets, and they are trying to attract those sort of urgently needed funds to help build roads, bridges, and then eventually try to develop based on that into other areas. And that was the case of Israel actually at the very beginning, and that was the attempt of India as well. I think other countries have tried more general revenue funds, general revenue sort of bonds, but haven't been as successful as those two cases.
I see. So I'm kind of curious as to what's really driving those investors into lending to their government of the countries of origin. Is this patriotism alone, or do governance factors also matter?
So this is where I guess the main, to me, is the main part of this conversation about diaspora bond comes in. Many times in these discussions, what analysts are looking at or policymakers are thinking about are the technical aspects of diaspora bonds. How much what would be the return, how much they could attract, how would they structure the sort of this contract, right, legally, and so on. Those are important considerations, but not the only ones. What matters really is the relationship that a country has with its diaspora. And this is why I mentioned diaspora definition at the very beginning. As I mentioned, we should not necessarily expect everyone whom we term a diaspora to move in one sort of direction or think in one way. The older the diaspora generation is, the more multi-layering we will be finding, and the more sort of disagreement or discontent with or differences in views we will be seeing. In fact, the word diaspora comes from actually to mean dispersion, and that's the dispersion of people, ideas, and intentions as well, because different people migrate for different reasons. And that's another point to make, is that migration in itself rather, let me restate this, diaspora in itself is not a migration, but it is made up based on migration. So in other words, simply that we're observing a large flows of labor migrants into different directions does not necessarily mean here's the country's diaspora. There are certain other factors that play a role in here. So this is why I think what you're asking is kind of, it doesn't have a simple answer. Patriotism, of course, plays a role, but only to the extent that again, let's go with the standard division view, our diaspora investor or our diaspora resident person has some sort of connection with the country, maybe emotional attachment indeed. In the case of labor migrants, what the evidence shows is that usually it is the personal connection that matters. It is probably the migrant's family that is still remaining in the old country, and the money goes through remittances, those regular transfers on smaller scale from the migrants to migrant's family. And some of the countries have tried to work with this, actually noticing that here's an almost uncontrolled flow of money. How can we actually direct this towards some sort of improvement in the local communities, in the regional economies, rather than that money just going to one family, the recipient family. And I mean, some time ago, I wrote a paper, this would be more than 10 or so years ago, suggesting that something of a migration development bank could be established, which would actually coordinate these flows and would be able to raise sufficient funds to invest domestically into the regional development, which would then actually stem and help sort of reduce the migration flows and help people stay in their native lands. But generally speaking, patriotism plays a role because the belief, and that's strong belief of sort of economists and other observers in the force of first movers, right? The power of first movers. And that's the term that comes from the late 90s, early 2000s, when, again, much of the world set on the move. And a big component in that was, of course, the contribution of migration from and around Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. Some of the countries at that time lost up to 20, if not more, % of their population due to migration, which in itself was caused by different reasons. But what is problematic with simply relying on patriotism, or I guess more generally, this could be termed altruistic sort of intentions, is the fact that they're very much sort of uncertain, right? And they quickly fade away for various reasons. One, our expatriate, let's call that, or diasporan, loses some type of a personal connection with the country, or they may over time start disagree with policies that are being sort of implemented in the country, their native country, and sort of semi-protest sort of move, they might decide to withdraw. But there's also a very simple explanation, and that is that for a lot of people in the diaspora, engaging with this perceived, and I insist on this, using on this word, perceived homeland, is engaging with that homeland is a difficult step to begin with. And this is where we need to understand the concept of the age of diaspora, which then explains the diversity of things. We have across different, not to pick on any one, but if we want, we can think of examples, but across different nations, we have, sure, representatives and people living in the diaspora sharing certain ethnic or cultural or religious common features, but for generations, they lived outside of that homeland. Over those century, even if we pick just the 20th century, 19th, 20th century, and now into the 21st century, countries have changed, borders have changed. There are generations of people who may claim certain ancestry, and there is a country with that name, but those people do not connect with that country. They connect with the certain historic portion of that country which once existed. And so for them, connecting with the country that currently exists on the map is sort of like asking them to, why aren't you connecting with this foreign country to begin with? I don't know if I'm explaining this clearly. If not, let me know. But and I'm trying to avoid picking on any specific examples. But essentially, it's a very, very complex situation. And to me, it boils down around sort of three points. First is the point on identity. Sure, most recent waves of migration, even if we take past 10, 15 years, and if we just look at people who have been moving around that time, there's certain stronger commonality among them. But what if we add to that the old diaspora? In other words, that those generations that grew up in the foreign countries over the past, let's say, 50, 70 years, right? For them, it's much more difficult to find those common connecting points in terms of their identity. They may know that they belong to an ethnic group X or religious group X, but they haven't lived, and their families haven't lived in the environment which is characteristic to the country X. They haven't lived there for the past 5 decades, right? So for them, coming in contact with most recent migrants, yes, emotionally at first fills sort of their hearts with enthusiasm and minds with great ideas, but essentially they have to learn how to speak new language and how to connect with each other. One of the defining this identity is very important. And what I mentioned about the differences about growing up in different regions and then certain countries now either shrinking or expanding, right, matters as well, because that sort of historical knowledge, that memory stays within households, within the smaller communities, and they organize around this idea. Okay, we come from a village XYZ, and it no longer is part of sort of our homeland. It is now somewhere, it is now sort of politically considered to be part of another country. Well, but we have this emotional connection with that village because our grandparents were from there. So for them, it's going to be very difficult to connect with what today is supposed to be their ancestral homeland. So building trust, if there's a difficulty with figuring out this identity, then building trust in terms of building communication within the diaspora community and then between diaspora and the country that seeks diaspora's input is a very hard labor. It's not a given. And this is why patriotism or emotional attachment are necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient conditions for investors to continue. Because the third component, that's the final part, has to come from actually the country that that tries to engage its diaspora. And I call it engagement infrastructure. whichever this country might be, and so this is where examples might be relevant. It is, if there is a decision to engage with the diaspora, then the country has to be proactive in all ways, and establish a clear, transparent framework and system of connection for anyone living abroad, but somehow interested in connecting with the country. This can be done in many different ways. For example, I'm an academic, so inviting academics to spend the summer, inviting people, let's say with small kids, organizing summer camps, or organizing cultural days in the diaspora communities abroad, and having actually representatives, country representatives, connecting with the diaspora on almost daily basis. What I'm mentioning are not, strictly speaking, financial indicators or macroeconomic indicators. These are very soft, sort of cultural aspects of connection, because this is what's needed. Sort of this cultural connection then solidifies everything else that we hope will come in terms of financial investment and economic engagement. But there's also the other side, and that is the diaspora communities themselves, because they are organized often depending on the sort of the sophistication of the community in terms of length of its existence abroad and general background and so on. There are the community groups and organizations, around religious communities, for example, and sort of the degree to which they influence their communities is very important as well. So again, if it is the country that that is in a difficult economic situation that probably wants to connect with the diaspora for the purposes of benefiting from this diaspora premium, because generally diasporas living abroad are more affluent and in better economic position, new skills, access to different sort of opportunities and so on. But the diaspora communities themselves need the country's existence, physical existence, for the purpose of finding their identities, especially for those that have lived abroad a very long time. To conclude, though, this point, this is why diaspora bond is so much a difficult exercise, especially today when many of the countries are already active in the international capital markets. And going and announcing a diaspora bond without having these preconditions taken care of, without figuring out these three pillars, sort of identity, trust, and engagement infrastructure, it is a risk that if you announce we're issuing a diaspora bond, but very few people in the diaspora would have any real interest, because for simply mistrust or other concerns, or they're not really sure or clear what the country wants, or what you asked what the bonds is for, then it hits back at the country's sort of the debt profile, right? And let's say rating agencies seeing this would say, well, if your own diaspora is not buying your paper, then probably there's something wrong with you. And downgrading country's rating then leads to all sorts of macroeconomic sort of, it becomes a cascading process, which is very difficult to stop. And convince the rating agencies saying, well, actually, we're trying to do what we can, but it's not really, it's not our fault, but it's too late. So homework has to be done before any diaspora bond is issued. Okay, so a long answer, but the question is very complex, and we can talk even more if you'd like.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting remark. The three elements, I do remember them. You said identity, trust, and engagement infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right. So this last question I would like to ask you is, you mentioned two countries in your study. I think it was Israel and India. Mm-hmm. Now, what lessons could other nations learn from those countries?
Okay. I think both experiences are very different, but I was thinking how to combine them into one lesson, and I think the lesson is adaptation. And this adaptation happened for in different ways for each of those countries. I think India's is the easiest to explain. India tried 3 times to issue a diaspora bond or appeal to its diaspora to attract funds at different stages through the 1990s. But it quickly realized the risks that were involved with that. And India's connection at that time with its diaspora was just developing to the stage that we think about it today. So it was a bit of a problematic process. They also realized the very basic fundamental issues and risks that would, once you enter the capital markets, there's a problem with currency risk, there's a credit risk, there's a problem with litigation as well. And so that mattered. And what India did, it adapted how it offered this opportunity, this engagement infrastructure for diaspora investors to connect with the country through a series of different other funds, not called diaspora bonds, but funding opportunities and through the banking, working through the banking system, and opening up the country essentially in supporting diaspora entrepreneurs. This is also the time around late 90s, early 2000s, the time when India started to see great interest from sort of people of general sort of Indian background, or what they would refer later as non-resident Indians, interested in investing in the country and pretty much starting from scratch the whole tech sector in India. I don't know how much anyone would remember, but the whole consulting scene, which kind of was global, relied very much on the support of consulting companies and in general companies working in the background in India, which were really built by the tech community of Indian nationals from elsewhere. So again, there was a step in the case of India, I guess what I'm trying to say, there was a move from pure sort of capital markets instrument, a diaspora bond, to a more comprehensive engagement with its diaspora, which I think is incredible because yes, nothing is ever perfect, but it worked to a great extent. And there are lots of examples of how some of those initiatives that were started back in the 90s continue to operate and help contributing to India's economy and helping as well with employment and sort of career growth for young professionals especially. Now, Israel is really the reason why we even are talking about the diaspora bond, because that's what Israel did. In the early 50s, the country was still new in the post-World War II system, global system, and simply going into the capital markets would have been difficult for a country like Israel at that time to actually fundraise. Right? Essentially, that's what Diaspora Bond is doing. It's helping countries fundraise for internal development. Well, the adaptation there was first to realize that Israel could appeal to the global Jewish community. The appeal was not an email as it happens these days sometimes. It was actually personal trips of the business and political representatives from Israel, engaging very much directly with the communities across the world, primarily, of course, in North America. But I think what impressed me as I was learning about this experience was the degree to which there was this personal involvement at every stage, and the ability at that time to hear and to listen to what the diaspora was telling Israel, right? Since then, since the launch of the first bonds, there have been significant sort of improvements. And at one point, the ability to borrow through this diaspora bond program was instrumental to, again, the development projects like building sort of water canals or electricity grids and so on, to the extent that it helped Israel not just develop in macroeconomic terms, but also in terms of improving its financial markets profile, helping country to access now capital markets on its own, not just because of its diaspora, but because it is a now stronger economy. And that's very important. And to that extent, the sort of the significance of the diaspora bond in the overall debt profile of Israel is now gradually declining, which is probably a healthy indicator, because the country is able to borrow, again, not because of its diaspora, but because it has its own sort of standalone economic system. The other part about adaptation, in addition to the personal appeals and this, of course, there was a patriotic move, but the patriotic move is the first step, but it has to be compensated by the country's ability to actually sort of ensure more trust in the diaspora investors. And so what I'm talking about is really transparency, right? So we can read about the program and diaspora bond program or Israel bonds program with incredible amount of detail, how and where the money is spent. Most recently, sort of the fund managers pretty much capitalizing on modern technology and development in financial markets have developed a system by which these bonds can be sort of donated into university endowments or someone's pensions, or somehow transferred from my account to someone else's account. In other words, simplifying sort of, let's call it in tech terms, the user side of the process is also a step towards the diaspora, which probably doesn't have the entire knowledge about what's going on, but seeing how the process is becoming more simplified and transparent gives some degree of comfort that the investment is justified, right, in the eyes of the diaspora investment, and of course the amounts that are involved in that. It does help, of course, to mention, it does help in the case of Israel, of course, and it needs to be mentioned as well, that in the 90s, early 90s, at the breakup of the Soviet Union and beginning of large migration of, let's say, Soviet people from the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, to Israel, let's say, Israel was granted some type of, without getting to technical things, a guarantee from the US government, which provided support in the case of sort of Israel's inability to pay back. And that guarantee has been sort of rolled over into present times. And for the global investor now, more general, it serves as an additional sort of signal of support, and also Israel's ability to pay back on its debt. To the extent that the diaspora bonds these days in Israel are not just about, let's say, just the Jewish diaspora, but it is really, as it is advertised, friends of Israel as well. So global investors outside of the diaspora are also part of that process. So I think, so what lessons the lesson to learn is the lesson of adaptation and research. Okay, doing your homework first before actually jumping into that field.
Thank you very much for that very detailed answer. That's it for this edition. For more information about this and other episodes, visit us at henrygeorgeschool.org. My name is Ibrahim, and thank you for watching Snapshots.
Thank you, Ibrahim.